I'm going to ask about both dimensions of your answer, but first we'll go with the first one. And I know the subject of this conversation hasn't been the complex ideology of World War One by any stretch, and that's something that we haven't touched on at all. But is there a simple enough way of explaining why you see it as having resulted from a failure of leadership and diplomacy?
Yeah, so briefly, I think that the war, I call the war a failure because uh, by the time you get to the 1910s, the major powers in Europe have all committed themselves to an arms race, and to an arms race that is complemented by secret treaties, diplomacy that commits itself to support each other. And though that system was fundamentally undemocratic, in fact, anti-democratic, it did not include the will of the people in any of these nations. And once the crisis of 1914 begins, it is very difficult for any of the leaders of Europe to stop it, and very few of them have the will or the imagination even to try. So that's why I say it's a failure of the system, the economic system, the military rivalry system, et cetera, but also a failure of leadership in stopping something that many people could see coming over the course of 1914.
And then, in the sense that this war for democracy talk may have been propaganda, I know that this was a time in which the United States really became a dominant military global power for the first time. And today, people are cynical. And even though I'm certainly not a contemporary historian or very well informed about the news, but people are cynical today about the wars that the United States gets into because they believe that the state or the people that compose the state stand to gain a lot of money from this or power in other ways. Was World War One, did it serve this purpose at all for the people in power at the time?
Uh, well, certainly that argument is there from the very beginning, right? And there is a concern, particularly in the United States, right, which does not enter the war in 1914 when it begins. A concern, across the political spectrum, in different, or found in different places on the political spectrum. Let's put it that way. That the war, is serving the interests of some and not all. And so there is a concern, for example, that the United States is selling weapons to Europe. Concern that the United States is lending money to the warring powers. And the fear that if the United States lends too much money to the European powers, that it will be on the hook, right? And that if Britain and France lose, then the American economy would collapse, and that it would sort of drag us into the war through a backdoor. So those concerns were there in the First World War. They persist into the eve of the Second World War, and they still exist today, although they are sort of less commonly part of our conversations.
Was there also this dimension of military industrial contractors with close ties to government and lobbying for funds and contracts and this sort of thing already?
There was, and they didn't have the term. It's not until 1960 that Dwight Eisenhower uses the phrase military-industrial complex. But people had an intuition that there was such a thing, and certainly the way in which the United States does end up mobilizing for the First World War leads to very close collaboration and cooperation between the government and private industry. And that was necessary, right, in order to sort of get get ships built, get weapons produced, get even uniforms from textile factories right out the door. After the war, particularly during the Depression, right, when there's more skepticism about corporate America, you start to see the emergence of a much more articulated understanding of what we would now call the military-industrial complex. And this even leads to 2 years of investigations by Congress, so-called Nye Committee hearings, that investigate the munitions industry, investigate banks, investigate all sorts of entities to sort of uncover those links. And by the 1930s, of course, they're not just trying to litigate the past, they're also concerned about the future, right? And they're worried that it would happen again. That as war clouds gather in Europe, there's a sense that if the U.S. doesn't attack this military-industrial complex, that there will be a second World War.